Hello, I'm Chevalier, and today we're going to be talking about the colonial independence and the Great Awakening, and this is a part of the SSUSH2 standard. We're going to start off with the first settlements. The first British settlement in the Americas was Jamestown, Virginia, and this was the first permanent settlement in the American colonies, and it was founded in 1607. About 90 years later, in the 1700s, about over 250,000 Europeans had migrated into the American colonies, most from England, but gradually more started to come from Germany, Ireland, Scotland, and the Netherlands. The Scottish and Irish immigrants commonly moved to the western frontier by the Appalachian Mountains, and when King Charles II granted William Penn the colony of Pennsylvania, a lot of German-speaking Europeans moved to Pennsylvania because of its cheap labor and low taxes. And this combination of these European cultures all mixed together to create the unique American culture that we know of today. Another benefit of moving to the American colonies was the religious freedoms that you were granted. So when William Penn, the founder of the colony of Pennsylvania, moved, he was a Quaker, and the Quakers were very tolerant of other religions, and they were even respectful to the Native Americans, and they were very strongly against slavery. Also, the Dutch, who had a colony called New Amsterdam, were very tolerant of other religions, including the Quakers and Jewish people. New Amsterdam, though, however, eventually was captured by the British and became New York. Now we're going to watch a quick crash course video, which will just kind of do another recap of everything I've said and go into a little bit more detail.
Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course U.S. History, and today we're going to cram 150 years of American history into one video. Why? Well, many American history classes don't cover the colonial period at all because most major American history tests have like one question about it. Mr. Green, so this isn't going to be on the test? That's awesome, because I have some flirtatious notes to exchange with Jessica Alvarez. Yeah, me from the past. So listen, would you rather do well on one test or lead a richer, more productive life as a result of having a better understanding of the complicated factors that led to the creation of the greatest nation in history? Stan, can I get a libertage? So listen up, me from the past. It's time to bask in our own greatness. And by greatness, I mean morally dubious dominance over people who would have been just fine without us. So contrary to popular mythology, colonial America was more than just Jamestown in Massachusetts. There was, for instance, New Amsterdam. The tale goes that Dutch traders bought the island of Manhattan from Lenape Indians for $24 in 1624. That isn't quite true, but it contains a truth. The Dutch traders who founded their colony were businessmen, and New Amsterdam was above everything else a commercial venture. This is still true in New York, actually. I mean, Manhattan is all about Wall Street. In fact, Crash Course writer and history teacher Raoul Meyer is believed to be the last person living on the island of Manhattan who does not work for an investment bank. So the Dutch let anyone into New Amsterdam who could help them turn a profit, including Jews and even Quakers, but they didn't like Indians very much. In fact, they drove them out of the colony. But anyway, the $24 the Lenape supposedly got for New England was $24 more than the Dutch got when the English took over the colony in 1664 by sailing 4 frigates into the harbor and asking for the colony in a threatening voice. So New Amsterdam became New York, which was a mixed blessing. The population doubled in the decade after the English takeover, but English rule meant less economic freedom for women who, under the Dutch, were able to inherit property and conduct business for themselves. And under the English, free black people lost a lot of the jobs they'd been able to hold under the Dutch. Things were better in Pennsylvania, so much so that it was known as the best poor man's country, which admittedly in the 17th century was a low bar to jump over. Given by Charles II to this guy, William Penn, in 1681, Pennsylvania was a huge tract of land roundabout here. The land included contemporary Pennsylvania and Delaware and New Jersey, but we've made an editorial decision not to talk about New Jersey here on Crash Course due to my long-standing anti-New Jersey bias. So Penn wanted his colony to be a haven for Quakers because he was a Quaker, as you know if you've ever seen a container of Quaker oats. Quakers were a pretty tolerant bunch, except when it came to slavery, which they opposed vehemently. And under Penn's leadership, the colony showed remarkable religious toleration and also an amazing respect for Indian communities, but then, after Penn was gone, yeah, the usual. In 1737, Pennsylvania colonists perpetrated one of the most famous frauds of colonial America, the walking purchase. Indians agreed to cede a tract of land bounded by the distance a man could walk in 36 hours, but the clever Governor James Logan hired a bunch of fast runners who marked out territory much larger than the Indians anticipated. Quakers had to resort to such tricks because they were pacifists. I should also mention that they weren't particularly fond of loose living. The government prevented swearing and drunkenness, for instance, but, you know, it was still pretty great compared to the other colonies. More than half of the male population was eligible to vote, and Pennsylvania's dual dual promise of religious freedom and cheap land attracted a lot of German immigrants. Well, I should say German-speaking immigrants. There was, of course, not a Germany at the time, as many viewers of Crash Course World History have pointed out to me. And now let us venture south, where we will find many mosquito-borne illnesses and somewhat less abolitionist sentiment. In 1663, English King Charles II gave 8 proprietors the right to set up a colony just north of the Spanish-controlled Florida to serve as a buffer. This became South Carolina, and its original settlers came from the sugar colony of Barbados, which helps to explain why they were so awesome at slavery. They tried to enslave the Indians and ship them to the Caribbean, but when that didn't work out, they began to import African slaves. We're going to talk a lot more about slavery in future episodes, but for now, just bear in mind it sucked. Okay, so in the last quarter of the...
Alright, that was just a nice recap from the Crash Course video. So now we're going to move on into talking about King James II. He was a Catholic totalitarian monarch who took the throne in 1685. And he single-handedly ruled without the regard of Parliament. This is speaking towards his totalitarian style of ruling. He has a similar style of rule as King Louis XIV of France and Peter the Great of Russia. He was also known to be quite a tyrant leader, having a standing military without the consent of Parliament. King James II also changed the way the American colonies were governed by removing the charter system and replacing it with governors appointed by himself. King James II, though, was overthrown only 4 years later as a result of the Glorious Revolution, and he was replaced by the Protestant Dutchman, King William III, and Queen Mary II, who signed the English Bill of Rights as a result of King James II being such a tyrant and totalitarian leader. The Parliament needed a guarantee that they would have more power in this next group of monarchs. And so the Parliament allowed the colonies to revert back to their old system of self-governments, hence removing the governors that King James II appointed. Parliament also decided to merge Plymouth and Massachusetts Bay into Massachusetts, and in 1721, Parliament, with their newfound powers, decided to appoint Robert Walpole to become the first Prime Minister of England. And this glorious revolution was an inspiration that led to many of England's colonies deciding to declare independence against England in the future. Next, we're going to talk about salutary neglect, which was an idea of Robert Walpole, the first Prime Minister of England, where he believed that colonies would be more profitable if they were allowed to produce without England's strict policies, such as the Navigation Acts. Until the French and Indian War, the salutary neglect was in effect, and colonies were allowed self-governance and the ability to build their own trade routes. The government in the colonies commonly consisted of a governor and elected legislator that would decide taxes, and these colonies would often hold town hall meetings where white landowning males were allowed to vote. Next, we're going to talk about a very kind of confusing area of this time period called Bacon's Rebellion. It's really interesting to read into more, but it's a very complex thing, so this is kind of the basics of it. It was led by a guy named Nathaniel Bacon, and he thought that it was right that everyone should be treated under the law. Again, this is not including slaves. But it began in Jamestown in 1670s, and the local legislator would only really look out for the wealthy colonists, so that would be the plantation owners, and they wouldn't really care about these indentured servants, which basically they were the white people who owed debts, and so they would work on these plantations to work off their debts, and once they paid off their debts, they were free, but they didn't have any money, so they couldn't afford to live in the towns, and so they had to live off on the frontier and often had violent conflicts with Native Americans. And this legislator with their militias, like the Jamestown elite, would never assist these indentured servants because they were thought to be less than the wealthy plantation owners. So Nathaniel Bacon unified and rallied against this and helped these indentured servants fight off the natives. But then he used the fire that he ignited with these indentured servants to start an armed rebellion against Jamestown and the Jamestown elite and his cousin, who was the governor of Virginia, Governor Berkeley. And Bacon's rebellion, though, caused government to work for the interest of all peoples, no matter, and that effect is still going on today. Next, we're going to talk about the Great Awakening, and this was a huge religious movement throughout Europe and the Americas during this time period, and it places an emphasis on an individual religious experience rather than a standard church doctrine. The Great Awakening challenged established authorities such as the Church of England, English monarchs, and Catholicism in general. The religious independence began to unify these colonists, and as they sought for their religious independence, they also started to look for their political independence. And this was an offspring of the Enlightenment, which focused on intellectuals, where the Great Awakening focused on all people's religious beliefs. And another aspect of the Great Awakening was that ministers began to urge Christians to adopt an emotional connection with Christ themselves rather than a standard international church doctrine. The Great Awakening also brought new denominations of Christianity to the Americas, such as Baptists, Methodists, and Presbyterians, and these denominations were able to challenge established religions like the Anglican Church and Puritans. Also, though, these churches began appointing their own ministers who would lead their own churches with their own doctrines, making it on a more local, personal level rather than the Catholic Church, where everything was based in Rome. And here's another crash course video, again, to just sum up everything I've been talking about. So, yeah.
Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course U.S. History, and today we're going to discuss the events political authority, and so was the Great Awakening, in which Americans awakened from being very religious to being super religious. The Great Awakening took place in the early decades of the 18th century, and it was a revitalization of religious feeling, energized by revival meetings and the introduction of new denominations. In the early part of the 17th century, most of the English colonists were Anglicans, unless you count the Catholics running Maryland. But by the time of the Great Awakening, there were also Presbyterians and Baptists and Methodists, so my! Even the old-line Congregationalist churches were challenged by so-called New Light ministers who placed less of an emphasis on predestination and more on an individual's experience of salvation or being born again. So religion became much more emotional in the colonies, especially after the arrival of the Englishman George Whitefield, who went on a preaching tour from 1739 to 1741. The main thrust of his sermons was that humans need only repent to avoid the horrors of damnation and be saved. And he believed that salvation was within each individual. It's worth noting that this rise in religious fervor was not confined to America or even to Christianity. Like, for instance, Wahhabism, the Islamic reform movement that's still very closely associated with Saudi Arabia, began in the Middle East around the same time. So one of the keys in the American Revolution was a breakdown in respect for authority. And this was fueled partly by economics, partly by political philosophies that undermined faith and governance from afar, and partly by religious revivals that criticized not only church hierarchies, but also other aspects of colonial society. I mean, if people were going so far as to criticize their religious leaders and established religious norms, is it any wonder that they would criticize the acts of a parliament working an ocean away? We'll find out next week. Thanks for watching.
And again, so that's just another recap going over the Enlightenment and how it allowed the spark of the Revolutionary War with, like he said at the end, if they could challenge the Anglican Church, why could they not challenge Parliament, etc. So as a general consensus of SSUSH2, it begins talking about how the first settlements were European immigrants moving into the eastern seaboard of the American colonies, so Massachusetts, Virginia, and then down south into South Carolina and everything. And then it talks about King James II and how he was overthrown by the Protestants of the King William III, who was actually Dutch, and his wife, Queen Mary II, and how they brought a lot of changes to the British system of government, allowing Parliament and then eventually getting a Prime Minister, which they still have today. And then how the colonies, because of the freedoms that Parliament allowed them, how the colonies developed their own independent democratic forms of government that we still use today. And then also we start talking about the Great Awakening and how this resulted in a lot of religious freedoms, and how the colonists started to realize that if they could gain these religious freedoms and challenge these established religious organizations, what would be so different than for them to challenge these established political organizations such as the French or the British or the Spanish. So once again, thank you for watching. Again, my name is Chevalier. I work with Mutimer, and this was our project on SSUSH2.